So let's return to the port of Livorno and examine in a bit more detail the way that trade functions within Livorno and globally in this period, and in the way that the Grand Duke was able to craft a neutral, more or less neutral, um, policy both on land and at sea. The port of Livorno by the late 17th century has really become an epicenter of trade in the Mediterranean and by extension globally in the products that are exchanged therein. The port itself at this point has become expanded, fortified, and is really considered a safe haven for many different merchants and peoples of diverse ethnic and religious background. As we can see from this engraving here, which is relatively faithful to what the port would have looked like in the 18th century, we have a system which is just perfectly designed for trade. So if you were a merchant, say, coming from England in this period, what you would have done is generally sailed from, for example, Dover down to Lisbon, traded some goods in Lisbon, and then continued on around through Gibraltar past the Iberian Peninsula, up and around the coast of France, and arrived outside the port of Livorno. English merchants were generally trading in Livorno for coin, for specie. They would bring cargoes of salted herring, cod, which was very important to the Italian population because being Catholic, they wouldn't eat meat on Fridays or all throughout the course of Lent. So fish was a commodity, even if it was a peninsula, it's a commodity that is always in high demand. Also grain. The port of Livorno is constructed not only for the Knights of St. Stephen, and not only because the other Tuscan port, Porta Pisa, was silted up by the continual deposits of the Arno River, but also because the Grand Duke needed a port that would be able to accommodate continual traffic in ships to bring in the goods that Tuscany very desperately needed, like grain, because as I mentioned before, there were a series of very bad harvests throughout the course of the 17th century, aside from natural disasters, and there were floods. Frequently the Arno River would flood both in Florence and in other areas, and also earthquakes. So the 17th and early 18th centuries, insofar as the climate is concerned, is a very rough period. So again, if you're an English merchant approaching the port, generally you would come in a system of caravans. Now what that is essentially a small flotilla of heavily armed vessels that would protect your merchant ships from marauders, from corsairs. Now these could be, of course, North African corsairs, or also, as the case may be, French, or Dutch, or Spanish, whomever you were particularly at war with in that given period. So this flotilla would generally arrive at Livorno, in which case part of the coterie might dock in Livorno, and part of it might continue on to another port in which there's a considerable English population, such as Messina in Sicily. And one of the first things that you have to do is wait outside the port for first to be greeted essentially by the Capitaneria, which is part of the port pilots that are part of the kind of local navy that come out and check your letters of patent letters, essentially, from where you last docked. So they want to know where your ship has been, what goods it's carrying, and does it have essentially official letters of permit to be engaged in those activities. So a ship, for example, that was coming from the Levant, so the eastern Mediterranean, or other ports where, for example, plague was often a large problem, the authorities in Livorno would often place those ships directly into quarantine, which meant that the ship generally had to wait for a period of 40 days outside of the city. And it's This rigorous system of quarantine that is responsible for the growth of Livorno, for the popularity of Livorno, because one can always be assured that you're going to find a salubrious, a healthy city when to do business in and to live in, if the case may be. And also, you're not, of course, there's no guarantee, but the probability of contracting plague or other infectious diseases that are generally transmitted through commercial networks is considerably less in Livorno than it is in other ports because of this very rigorous quarantine system. It's something that, however, merchants continually complained about because, as you might imagine, if there's any suspicion of sickness whatsoever on this ship, the soldiers, or excuse me, the sailors themselves, could be sent to what is called the lazaretto, which is sort of like a quarantine hospital, and they would be kept there until whatever signs of sickness they had dissipated or they died. Generally, the only two ways to get out of the lazaretto. And then the quarantine, the contents of the cargoes would often be sort of fumigated and treated in whatever methods they had at that point to try and rid the sickness from the ships. So there were also these essentially port doctors that were kept by the Sanità, which is the sort of Department of Sanitation of the port of Livorno. And they would go regularly onto these ships, and they would then take a list of all the men who are on board and describe their state of health. I've looked through some of these documents. They're fairly formulaic, but they're very interesting for the wealth of information that they provide about the functioning of this port system in the 17th and 18th centuries. So if you're given a clean bill of health and otherwise allowed by the captain of the port to sail in, you would sail past the mole, which is this large fortified construction that juts out. It's essentially a breakwater, and its construction is sort of seen as a modern marvel because it provides a secure harbor. And then if you needed to do other business in the port, you would either send a smaller caravel, a smaller series of ships, which would then pass the little, would go through the small passageway, the narrow passageway between the Fortezza Vecchia, which you see there, sort of in the center left of the engraving, into the Darsena, which is the inner harbor there. And it's there that goods can be unloaded. They might be then carted away or carried by smaller ships or smaller boats through the canals of Livorno, which are in the upper left-hand corner of this engraving. And that is the corner that, again, it's called the Venezia Nuova, the New Venice. And this was the perfect place of residence for a merchant because you have warehouses that are built on the ground floor with subterranean caverns where you could store all of one's goods. And these subterranean caverns would have little passageways which would lead out onto the canals. So you could have a boat that would essentially pull right up to your warehouse, and they could unload barrels or bales of your goods, which could then be pushed through this passageway directly from the water right into your basement storage area. And then above that level, you would have essentially your place of business, your shop or your counting house or your bank, as they were often called. And above that level, you would have the family residences or the residence, living quarters of the merchant, perhaps his family, and any rooms that they would let out to rent-paying inhabitants. Another curious thing about Livorno in this period is that in this engraving you can see it too. You can see a number of what appear to be steeples, little towers all over the city. These are not, all of them are not actually steeples. Some of them are, but a good deal of them are little towers which were built on the top of merchant houses. And you might ask yourself, well, why? It's not just to get a good view of the surrounding countryside. It's so that they could have a bird's eye view, a clear view down to the port to see when their ships were coming in, so that they would be able to run down, essentially, and take care of business as efficiently and as quickly as possible. Or if they had heard through their network, their correspondence networks, that other ships containing luxury goods or goods that were in high demand were coming in, they could send someone running down to the harbor to get their hands on that particular good before other merchants would have a chance to uh, obtain them for themselves. And one of the main places of business in Livorno, besides the dogana, which is essentially the customs house, where you pay customs duties, anchorage duties, anything that any kind of taxes you need to pay for keeping goods in the port. But aside from that, you also have the Piazza d'Arme, which is now known as Piazza Grande, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, open air square in certainly in Italy, but possibly also in Europe during that period, in which you have continual flux of people setting up stalls. There's a bartering and exchange of goods and services. It was a place where you would go for gossip, also to meet up with other merchants. There were in several of these colonnaded buildings that you see on the left and right hand side of the square. You had offices in which you could buy ship insurance, which was extremely crucial to the functioning of the trading networks in the Mediterranean, but also globally at that time. You could never really have it would be extremely risky to conduct a voyage without first having a insurance contracted on that cargo that you were, if you were a merchant, you were sending from point A to point B. And the way that many of the merchants who operated in Livorno, and certainly most of the European ones, was that they were part of a system that was roughly organized into large trading companies. So companies such as the English Levant Company, which operated, as one might imagine, in the Mediterranean, or the Dutch East India Company, or the English East India Company. Some of these were monopolies. They were chartered companies that were given, essentially a royal charter by the head of state. Some of them were joint stock operations, which were more and more popular as the 17th century progressed. One example, the most famous example, being the East India Company of England. And aside from these affiliations of merchants organized into large trading companies, which not all of them were. Some of them were sort of free agents or interlopers, as they were known. The other way that you find communities of merchants organizing themselves at this period, especially in Livorno, is generally under a loose or under a loose confederation of diplomatic appointments. So what I mean by this is that if you have, for example, I'll return to the English case, English merchants in the Mediterranean, you have small communities across the Mediterranean basin of merchants, which are known as factories. And each merchant factory generally has a consul that represents it. The consuls then report to the ambassador, who is stationed in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and that ambassador then generally reports back to the board of directors of the Levant Company, which is in London, and it's a kind of hybrid position. He is both a representative of the company, but also of the state, of the sovereign, of the English king. The way that this worked in Livorno was a little bit different, particularly in the English case. There was an English merchant who was appointed consul, who would represent the interests of the English nation, but the merchant factory, or the merchant community, the English merchant community of Livorno, was not officially part of the Levant Company, was not mentioned in the royal charter that was signed by the king to give them their monopoly over the trade in the Mediterranean. So there's sort of in a gray area, and this has interesting consequences that I will discuss later. But Livorno itself in this period again becomes known as the city of the nations, because there's such a multicultural environment at work. And they're known as the nations, the nazione, because each community is grouped under its its own subheading of being either the Dutch nation or the English nation. Now, anyone who spoke English essentially was thrown in together with the English nation, even if they were from Scotland or Ireland. For the Tuscan authorities, they were essentially all Nazione Inglese, which is the English nation. Same goes for the Dutch, whether they're from any part of the Netherlands. They were generally grouped there. This meant that these merchants banded together in common causes when it was expedient for them to do so, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these were little colonies in the way that we think of colonies, for example, of Jamestown in the New World. These were groups of men that were businessmen. They worked together when they needed to, but that didn't mean they weren't also more than willing to go to court against one another if a commercial conflict should arise. It makes for an extremely fractious, difficult to govern city in certain respects. And what we find is that over the course of the 17th century, the office of the governor of Livorno, so the highest authority in Livorno in this period, hears more and more what are called supplications. So these are audiences that are granted. There's the court of the governor, which is sort of a real judicial court in which people can go and have cases tried, but it's also a court in the sense that merchants bring their petitions to the governor, where he then decides on a case-by-case basis. There's also, again, court of the sea consuls in Pisa, which hears more important cases that are dealing with quite a bit more money, and for cases that can't be decided there or that are really major kind of international consequence, they're sometimes heard directly by the Grand Duke himself, even though it's much rarer. So one of the main ways that, aside from having sort of networks of consuls and ambassadors or organizing themselves into joint stock companies or chartered companies, the actual nuts and bolts of commercial activity, of trading in the Mediterranean and indeed globally, rested on extremely complicated systems of credit. Actual coinage being exchanged, so money, specie, coins, in and of themselves, across a great geographic expanse that was the Mediterranean. It was an extremely tricky business. There are many different varieties of coinage that are being used. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but for the moment I want to focus on this, which is a letter of exchange. Now, the letter of exchange, lettera di cambio, or a letter of credit as the case may be, was essentially a way that merchants had developed, Italian merchants actually, in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, but becomes more and more in use in the early modern period, so really in the period we're talking about now, is essentially a way for merchant houses to extend systems or extend credit to one another without having to deal in coinage itself. The way that it would work was essentially this. If you have, say, a ship captain who you need to pay, and you're a merchant, and you have a merchant house in London, and you're sending a cargo of salted fish from London to Livorno. One way that you might pay him is essentially to write a letter of exchange, a letter of credit to this merchant, and you say, take this letter here, and I'm signing it that on this day, in this place, I pay you so and so this amount of money. Take this letter to my associate in Livorno, and he will give you X amount of money. And then my associate, essentially in Livorno, makes a mark in his accounting, in his letter books and in his account books, that says that I owe him that much money in the next available opportunity that I am to pay him for. So you see how this might get complicated then, in the sense that I have now sent a ship captain to my associate in Livorno. So I'm now in debt with my associate in Livorno. And I can also say, essentially, if that debt needs to be repaid, I might send another one of my associates there with another letter of marque that can call upon another merchant then to pay back that debt to the original associate who paid that amount of money to the ship captain. So what this requires is a very extensive, very detailed system of record keeping. Every merchant would have a letter book in which they would make copies of the original letters that they sent out of their correspondence. They would have an account book in which was double entry, so both of debits and credits, and they would keep very, very precise accounts of where they stood, with whom, how much, when, that sort of thing. And then they would also have what's sort of called a waste book. And these are books that, as the title might suggest, don't often last throughout the ages, in the sense that they're sort of like more rough record keeping, everything that needs to be written down in a hurry, and they are oftentimes thrown away after they're recopied into other ledgers in a more organized form. So these were the sort of mechanisms that were then in place for long distance merchant networks to function. So just briefly, I'm going to show you a few images of some coinage that was very popular in the Mediterranean, but indeed globally in European merchant networks of this period. So one of the most famous, which is something I'm sure all of you have even heard about, is the piece of 8. These are the famous Spanish autoreales, so pieces of silver, or silver coins, that come from New World silver. And they're interesting because they were often broken up, as you can see from this picture, into quite literally 8 pieces of the coin. And this was one of the most common forms of currency in the Mediterranean in this period. Another coin that's really quite common in the Mediterranean, but also in the New World, in the colonies of North America, for example, is the Leeuwendaalder, or the lion dollar, which oftentimes was adopted by merchants to pay off debts, just as was the piece of 8. So it's not as if just because you're an English merchant and you're doing business in Livorno, for example, it doesn't mean that you'll be doing it in pounds, which would be your native currency, or in scudi or ducats, in the case may be, which would be the local currencies that were used in Tuscany. Oftentimes within the confines of the port itself, you might be dealing in the lion dollars or in the pieces of 8 because they were simply more accessible. Coinage is still something that is going through a process in the 17th century of being regularized, of being standardized, in the sense that the amount of silver that you would find in each coin no longer fluctuated as wildly as it might have in the 16th century. So finally, just to wrap up, since I know this lecture is running a little bit long this week, I'd like to return again to the difficulty of maintaining a neutral state and a neutral port in Tuscany and in Livorno during this period. The Medici really had their work cut out for them. They were in an unenviable position. Both at land and at sea, they found themselves really sort of outclassed and outspent by the major European powers. The best strategy that the Medici could hope to adopt in this period was one of neutrality. They're sort of the Switzerland of the Italian peninsula. As I already discussed, one of the ways that they were able to maintain a sort of territorial neutrality was to play a kind of game of cat and mouse with the idea of the soccorso, in the sense that they debated when they really had to send troops to the Holy Roman Emperor to help them out. And they also employed sort of armies of lawyers to buy them time. And they also tried as much as possible, both Grand Dukes, to stay out of major European conflicts insofar as they were able, through tactics of delay, of obfuscation, as was the case with the support. So when push came to shove, they also liquidated certain assets, such as in the sell-off of the 75% of the navy to the French king in the 1640s. And finally, they adopted tactics that put into law the neutrality, which had hitherto been sort of an unofficial/official position. In 1646, the Grand Duke officially declared that Livorno was a neutral port. And later, significantly later, after the end of the War of Spanish Succession, this was recognized by all major European powers at the Treaty of London in 1718. So this official neutrality, as we've touched on before, meant that almost anyone could unload prize vessels, so vessels taken by privateers, and sell them at public auction in Livorno. They could also sell the cargoes, whether they were human or objects, in Livorno, which meant that a steady revenue stream was coming into the Grand Duchy through Livorno in the form of taxes and fees, that sort of thing. Insofar as was possible, the remaining navy attempted to maintain the neutrality of the port and to avoid scrapes with other major European powers. When they needed to, at times, they would still engage in privateering activity, but after the 1640s, the duties of the Knights of St. Stephen were more or less limited to that of defense. And the only time that the port essentially could come under fire was when it would have foreign aggressors, who would end up duking it out within the confines of the port itself. For example, in 1653, with the Anglo-Dutch War, which was a large-scale, several years conflict which took place between the Netherlands and England, and one of the battles actually took place outside the port of Livorno, in which case English vessels were finally allowed to enter the port, but the captain of the port warned both parties that if fighting took place, if it happened to break out, the cannons, which ringed all along the exterior sea-facing part of the fortifications, would defend the attacked party. So battle was fought actually just outside the mole of the port, and by all contemporary accounts, the English lost. So in this case, because they had flaunted the neutrality of the port, the Dutch community itself was slapped with a bunch of restrictions in response to their admiral's aggression. And based upon this example, other European powers were generally, after that point, more cautious about engaging in armed conflict in the port itself. So there's always sort of a delicate balance that has to be maintained when one has to essentially embark upon a strategy of neutrality in the early modern period. So for this week, you'll be reading for your primary source the Italian phrase book of Charles Longland. And I find it to be a tremendously interesting document. You perhaps may or may not, I hope you do. Charles Longland was an English merchant who was resident in the port of Livorno for several decades. And he served as the English community's consul during the 1650s. And his phrase book is an interesting document for what it has to tell us about Anglo-Tuscan relationships in the 17th century, and the way that both commercial and social relationships were negotiated within the port. So have fun taking a look at that. You'll also get a chance to see what English handwriting looks like in the early 17th century. And if you'd like a challenge, you can try transcribing some of the phrases yourself. I will also provide a list of selected transcriptions, which I've done for you in a plain Word document, because the handwriting is a bit challenging, I will admit. So Have fun reading that phrase book, and I look forward to seeing you all on the discussion board.